Hey, this is Connor with Biker's Edge, and today we've got the Megatower.
Can't remember anything, but I know we got lit.
So I try really hard when I do these bike reviews to not get too excited or be too much of a bummer. I try to pay attention to the things that actually matter and the bigger picture. I never want to come across as a hater or maybe even worse, a fanboy. But today, I'm gonna have a pretty hard time staying level-headed. So the Santa Cruz Megatower V2 second iteration dropped today. I've had one tucked away in my garage for the last little bit now. Been putting a ton of miles in on this thing. So is it gonna be love or hate? Stick around to find out. All right, so I normally don't get too into geometry and build kit details because I feel like it's easy enough to just Google that. But today's a bit different. The bike launched today, so here's your Google that. So the Megatower V2 has been completely redesigned from the first one. It has more travel, new geometry, and an updated suspension curve. So for this year, it has 165 millimeters of rear travel, and it's built around a 170 millimeter fork. So the geometry has been brought up to pretty current, modern day standards for a modern enduro bike. So the most significant updates are making the front end of the bike a little bit slacker and pairing the front triangle to a size specific chainstay. So bigger sizes get a bigger chainstay, which, if you haven't heard me say that before, should just be standard on every bike. So thank you, Santa Cruz. That head tube angle gets a little bit slacker, about 1 degree to 1.5 degrees, depending on the geometry setting in that flip chip. So it goes from 63.5 degrees to 63.8 degrees. The reach stays largely unchanged. It's within a few millimeters of the old version, but because that front end slacker, the wheelbase does grow 30-ish to 35-ish millimeters depending on the size. And, which is really cool for tall guys like me, the seat tube angle gets significantly steeper at 77.5 to 77.8 degrees. One of my favorite things about this bike is the updated suspension curve. It has a more linear rate of progression, so it's a little bit more consistent through the entire stroke. And it has a lower leverage curve with a bigger shock, so it has a lot softer off the top feeling to it. The suspension on this bike, spoiler alert, became the standout feature. We will definitely get more into that, but for now, that refined suspension curve is nice. And lastly, something super cool to see is the Megatower is the first Santa Cruz frame to come with what they're calling the glove box. That is their in-frame down tube storage. It comes with a tool wallet and a tube purse. So 2 little organizers that you can slide in there. So now let's get to the fun part, how this thing actually rides. All right, here we go. Starting out on the Santa Cruz Megatower. I am beyond stoked to ride this thing. Might be jumping the gun a little bit here on this trail, but we'll see how it goes. Might run into a little bit of snow. Yeah, there's a bit. That's all good. Oh, I slid out right at the end there. Not good. Just makes all the tough, challenging climbs just a little tougher. I cannot believe how well this bike climbs. Like, even just in the first couple minutes, does not feel inefficient. Doesn't have that like big, slow, stuck in the mud feeling that most really big enduro bikes have. Here we go. Whew. Everything being wet does not make this easier. So this bike actually rides and climbs like a lot lighter, smaller bike. It's kind of got that like trail, all mountain bike efficiency. Does not feel like a 165 mil enduro bike, like at all. It actually doesn't feel all that like unmanageable in all this tighter, techie, rocky stuff. Doesn't feel like you have to swing ultra wide. Doesn't feel too hard to get the bike to go where you want it to go. Pretty impressed. If there was an uphill race with all the enduro bikes, this is the one I'd put my money on. All right, gonna get a little bit of downhill time in here now on some snowy, slushy rocks. Doesn't sound scary at all. Whoa. Got some high speeds. All right. This is sick.
thing just eats up rocks like nothing. All right, sketchy snowdrop. Oh, not sketchy at all on this. This bike is really nice on big hits like that. Pretty gooey and soft, but like well supported the whole way through. Never just wallows. And surprisingly, gets off the ground pretty okay. And on some of this like slower speed tech, doesn't really feel big and cumbersome, even though it like technically is. I think Santa Cruz works some magic here on that suspension design. Woo-hoo-hoo. I freaking love this thing. That jumps so well, corners pretty well, really can't think of any complaints. I really try hard to not fanboy over bikes, but here we are fanboying just a little bit. I should just jump that thing, but it's really scary. Dry. Nice. This bike carries a lot of speed in that. Should we try dumb things? Oh, that was sick. I've never hit that before. All right, let's head back to the garage, see what this bike is for, see what it's good at, and who's going to enjoy it. Spoiler, I think it's going to be a lot of people.
All right, so let's jump into climbing performance. So if you've ridden any of the first generation lower link VPP bikes, so anything really from the last 1 to 3 years, you'll be very familiar with that suspension feel. It's a little bit soft, it kind of sits down in the mid-stroke, and on the climbs it gives you a ton of traction and control over the bike, which makes it a very, very good technical climber. It climbs very steep things really well, but it doesn't always make for the fastest climbing times. It's not the most efficient platform. The Megatower V2 is an exception to that. So it's on its second generation of the lower link VPP now, and it feels a lot more like that Santa Cruz Heckler. I know it's weird to compare it to an e-bike on the climbs, but it has that same feel. So super soft off the top, so it has great traction, great small bump control, keeps that wheel on the ground for climbing, but it does all of that without being inefficient. This bike feels really snappy, really quick, and it makes the bike climb like a much lighter bike. So I am currently midway through doing an enduro bike showdown. Just a couple months ago, I finished up the all mountain bike showdown. So I've been riding a lot of this style of bike lately, and the Megatower is as good or better than really any bike I have climbed on in the last 6 months in this category. I mean, I think it holds its own against even the shorter travel, lighter weight all mountain bikes like the Ripmo, the Hightower, SB130. It is that good on the climbs. It kind of has that snappy, quick to accelerate feel of the older style of VPP, but combined with the traction of the lower link VPP. I am beyond impressed with how well this thing climbs. It is pretty freaking remarkable. It really has no business climbing as well as it does, but here we are. So for me, a bike's climbing ability comes down to a couple of things. First is efficiency, next is traction, then the body position or the climbing position, and last is weight. And the Megatower actually does very, very well in all of those categories. In addition to the suspension being awesome, efficient, giving you a lot of traction, the geometry puts you in a very good climbing position on this bike. And the size-specific chainstays are huge here. You get onto really steep stuff and you don't feel like you're falling off the back of the bike. You don't feel like that front end is lifting up on you because the chainstays are made for you. So we've got a climb here in Salt Lake called Terror Ridge. Getting up there is just awful. Even on an e-bike, it's a tough, challenging climb. I have always joked about seeing the type of person who could clean that climb on a regular bike, not an e-bike. Turns out all it takes is a Joe Schmo on a pretty exceptional bike and you can do it. So to wrap up the Megatower's climbing ability, it goes uphill with the efficiency of a much smaller bike, but also the traction and control that you'd expect from a 165 millimeter bike. All right, now we're jumping into the downhill, and if I sounded like a fanboy on the ups, it's about to get worse because the bike gets better. The Megatower feels like a cloud with wheels. It is so plush, but it doesn't feel like a pig stuck in the mud. It actually reminds me a lot of the Heckler in how that suspension feels. Really soft off the top, and then tons of mid-stroke support, lots of bottom-out support. It feels pretty bottomless. But the best thing about it is that it is big and burly without always feeling big and burly. In fact, I rode this bike for the first couple of times completely blind. I hadn't seen any geometry numbers, travel numbers, anything about it. Jumped on the bike, just started riding. And at the end of that, I wrote down all of my guesses for like head tube angle, seat tube angle, travel numbers, wheelbase, all of that. And most everything I guessed actually came back less aggressive or more on the all mountain side than what the actual numbers are. So that goes to show you that the bike, it is big and burly, but it doesn't always ride that way. So the first generation Megatower took some pretty aggressive handling to really get it to come alive and to be fun. And that makes sense. It was designed for EWS racers who are pretty aggressive bike riders. The second version of the Megatower actually is a lot more approachable. It's a lot more user-friendly for Joe Schmoes like me. You don't have to be going 800 miles an hour for it to feel comfortable. It is so smooth through all the small bumps, the big bumps, off the jumps, the drops. It is very, very smooth everywhere. And with bikes like that, you usually find that they wallow or sit in the mid-stroke, that they aren't easy to get off the ground, they rob some of your energy and momentum in corners. But the Megatower does not do that. It has that same fairy dust sprinkled on it that the Heckler does. It is super soft in that initial stroke, but then the mid-stroke and the end stroke are just solid. You can pump, you can jump, you can bunny hop, you can unweight. So much better than you would guess with how soft that initial stroke is. When you're doing all that kind of fun stuff, it feels so much more like a 140 mil travel trail bike than it does the 165 millimeter enduro bike that it actually is. But when you start slamming into rocks at no regard for human safety speeds, that's when it really feels like the big 165 mil travel bike that it is. So you pair that incredible suspension design to some really well thought out geometry, and you've got yourself a really good bike. I'm really happy Santa Cruz just didn't try to one-up everybody and make the slackest, burliest bike they could. I think they toned it back just a hair. It's slack, don't get me wrong, it's slack, it's big, it's long, but there are much slacker and longer bikes out there. That head tube angle is right in the Goldilocks zone where it's slack enough for anything you're ever gonna wanna ride without being too unwieldy and too cumbersome when you get on mellower terrain. So the handling on this bike is somewhere between I can't turn and I turn when I don't want to. It's not squirrely, it's not impossible to turn. It's pretty in the middle there. I will say it does feel much better at high speeds than it does at slower speeds. So to wrap this up, for a bike this big, it feels surprisingly manageable, maneuverable, and agile. It never feels too burly, but it's always burly enough. I honestly think it's as well-rounded and as versatile as most all-mountain bikes, let alone enduro bikes. So a couple of quick comparisons. This list might seem random, but these are the bikes I thought of while riding the Megatower. They're also bikes that I've ridden recently and can remember and actually talk about. So the first, Santa Cruz Heckler. It feels a lot like that Heckler minus the extra weight and the motor. It has that same feel with the suspension and with the geometry. It's actually very, very close. Everyone's gonna ask, I don't know how it compares to the Bronson. I personally have never ridden the new Bronson. I wish I could tell you. Next up, we have the Norco Range. So you jump on the Norco Range and your brain switches. You turn into downhiller mode and nothing really scares you anymore. You try big stuff, you go faster. The Megatower has that same feel. You jump on it, your mentality changes. You get just a little bit more confident and a little more aggressive. How they differ is the Range really wants to go straight and it wants to do it very quickly. The Megatower doesn't really mind making turns or changing direction or bunny hopping or jumping. In a straight line, it's not quite as capable as the Norco Range, but it is more versatile because it's a little more maneuverable and manageable. It's also a much, much better climber. So next up, we have the Transition Sentinel. This is the bike I ride most days. It is the bike that I have, so everything gets compared to it. On paper, these two bikes are almost identical. The Megatower has a little bit more travel, but the geometry numbers are within a couple tenths of a degree and a couple millimeters on all of the key numbers. So they actually feel very, very similar. The Megatower feels a little bit more plush, and it does feel a little bit more bottomless and capable when it gets really, really rough. Don't think it really pays much of a penalty on the climbs though. It climbs as well, if not better, than the Sentinel. So I don't have a ton of time on the Megatower just yet, but honestly, I think these two bikes are fairly interchangeable. I think you could pick one or the other and be very, very happy on either one. And lastly, let's compare this to the Rocky Mountain Altitude, because the Altitude is a little bit more on the all-mountain side of the enduro category. It's not as aggressive as like the Norco Range. So it's a bit more of a versatile enduro bike. The Megatower is the exact same way, except on paper it is as burly as the Range, or it's close to as burly. I would say that the Megatower climbs a little bit better, and I think when it really comes down to it, it is a bit more capable, but they're both very, very well-rounded, versatile enduro bikes. So who is this bike for? I know this bike is in the enduro category, but I think it's as versatile as an all-mountain bike with the added capability of an enduro bike. So if you're looking for a go anywhere, do everything kind of bike, it sounds weird, but this one is that bike. Because of how well it climbs and because of how well it handles mellow terrain, it's not gonna suck when you're doing easy, mellow trails. You're gonna be able to climb just fine, hang with your friends, hang with your kids. You're gonna ride blues and not hate the bike. But then you go to the bike park or you go ride something where you're in over your head. This bike has the capability to get you through it. It thrives there. It's a ton of fun there. And I don't think you pay too many penalties to get that. It's really not as pigeonholed as most enduro bikes are. I really think it will cover everyone from the EWS Pro to the dad farting around with his kids at the bike park on a Saturday. So the one-line bike review, just to wrap this thing up, the Megatower has all mountain bike versatility with enduro bike capability. We have a bunch of these bikes on order. Give us a call, send us an email, hit up the web chat on our website, and we'd be happy to help you find one. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.